One of the first things you learn when studying Old English literature is how little of it has survived to the modern day. Between the dissolution of the monasteries and the Cotton Library fire, the bulk of the Old English literary corpus has been lost, and most of what remains is fragmentary. This is part of what makes Beowulf so exceptional. It's uncommon for an Old English manuscript to be found in such a complete state. This scarcity means that finding any amount of Old English writing is a cause for excitement, even if the discovered document is only a few lines of poetry. In 1860, in the Royal Library of Copenhagen, librarian E.C. Werloff was sorting through a bundle of loose parchment when he found two fragments which he labeled as Fragmenta duo Anglo-Saxonica membranacea. The pieces of parchment were in terrible shape, covered in small holes and creases, likely having been repurposed as book covers, but they contained something exceptional: 63 lines of Old English poetry, depicting the moments prior to a battle between characters named Waldere and Guthere. Professor George Stevens soon published an edition of the poem accompanied by critical material. This first publication was called 2 Leaves of King Waldere's Lay. Though most simply call this poem Waldere. The text was written in the late 10th or early 11th centuries, possibly by an Anglo-Danish or Anglo-Frankish scribe. On their own, the fragments don't preserve enough of the poem to draw a complete narrative, but by comparing them to other texts, experts have been able to reconstruct much of its content. Several characters mentioned in the fragment, such as Waldere, Guthere, Hagen, and Attila, have clear equivalents in contemporaneous legends from mainland Europe. Based on this, scholars have determined the poem is an Old English version of the story of Walter of Aquitaine. They've also roughly determined the length of the poem. The level of focus given to the pre-battle oratory has led scholars to believe the work was likely around 1,000 lines. This would mean the full poem was around a third of the length of Beowulf. To understand these fragments and the story they contain, we first need to understand the early medieval tradition of Walter of Aquitaine and the broader Germanic legendary canon. In particular, we need to discuss the only version of the story contemporary to Waldere, a Franco-Latin work of 1,450 lines, written in the 9th or 10th century, called Waltharius. By comparing Waldere to this Latin poem in the broader tradition, we can better understand its contents. The legend of Walter of Aquitaine takes place in a popular time period for early medieval Germanic legends, the Migration Era. This was the period of late antiquity when nomadic tribes ventured into the remains of the Western Roman Empire, establishing many of the kingdoms which would define the Middle Ages. Stories set in this era tend to prominently feature the Franks, Goths, Burgundians, and Huns. Examples of works in this tradition include the Nibelungenlied, Beowulf, and many of the Norse chronicles and sagas we discussed in the Skuldunga saga video. These legends also had a prominent recurring cast, with characters derived from real history, such as Theodoric the Goth or Attila the Hun, and others being purely fictitious, such as Hagen or Siegfried. Walter primarily fits into the latter category. His name is likely derived from Wallia, a Visigothic king of Aquitaine, but his story has little in common with the historical figure. Versions of Walter's story appear in a variety of sources, mainly Norse sagas and German poems, but most of these are written centuries after even the latest estimate for Waldere's composition. The earliest, most complete account, and likely the source for those later versions, is the Latin poem Waltharius. This poem is the most iconic version of the story and will serve as the basis for comparison for Waldere. Waltharius tells the story as follows. Attila the Hun and his people are ravaging Europe, much to the concern of neighboring kingdoms. To secure peace with the Huns, many Germanic monarchs give up their children as hostages to be raised by Attila. King Gibico, unwilling to send his own son Gunther, instead sends a youth from his kingdom named Hagen. King Hereric sends his daughter Hildegund, and King Alfar of Aquitaine sends his son Walter. The three grow up and raise in the ranks of Attila's court. Walter and Hagen become key warriors in the Hunnish army, and Hildegund helps run Attila's royal estate. Gibico dies, and Gunther inherits the throne, refusing to pay the Huns tribute. Hearing of this, Hagen returns to his people. Paranoid that Walter will leave as well, Attila and his wife attempt to marry Walter to a Hunnish woman. Already betrothed to Hildegund, Walter refuses the offer, and the hostages hatch a scheme to escape. While the Huns are getting drunk during a feast, the two flee with a great deal of stolen treasure. An enraged Attila awakes the next morning to command his army to follow Walter, but they refuse in fear of the hostages' reputation. Meanwhile, in his capital of Worms, Gunther is proving himself to be an inexperienced and somewhat childish king. He hears about Walter's flight with a pile of Hunnish treasure, and reasoning that a fair amount of it must have been taken in raids on his kingdom, decides to seize the treasure. Hagen advises against attacking Walter, but reluctantly follows his king's commands. Gunther, Hagen, and 11 other warriors ambush Walter and Hildegund, leading to the bulk of the poem's line count, in which Walter faces the warriors one-on-one. They wield a variety of weapons such as battle axes and bows, but are handily dealt with by Walter using a spear, sword, and shield. As each of the opponents are defeated by Walter, Hagen advises Gunther to let Walter go, and is ignored by the crazed king, who is committed to defeating the warrior and claiming his treasure. The sequence is capped off by an attack using a strange three-pronged spear. Walter slays the last of his assailants, leaving just Gunther and Hagen. Down to just the two of them, Gunther and Hagen decide to ambush Walter the following day. Seeing them coming, Walter sends Hildegund to flee. This leads to a 2-on-1 battle between the three warriors. This is probably Waltharius' strongest section, doing a great job contrasting the seasoned warriors Hagen and Walter and the inexperienced Gunther. It's also where the poem's most compelling subplot, the conflicting loyalties of Hagen, reaches its conclusion, with him choosing his king over his friend and foster brother. Walter is able to overpower Gunther, cutting off his leg below the knee. He attempts a final blow, but Hagen blocks the attack with his helmet, and surprisingly, Walter's sword shatters on impact. Walter pauses a moment in shock with his hand outstretched. Hagen takes advantage of this and cuts off Walter's hand. Undeterred, Walter slides his shield onto his right arm and draws a spare sword with his left hand. According to the poem, it was typical for Hunnish warriors to carry two swords. He then slashes across Hagen's face, taking out an eye and several teeth. With each of the warriors injured, the battle is finished. Hildegund returns to the scene and patches up the warriors' wounds, with all three miraculously surviving. Hagen and Walter make jokes about each other's injuries before heading their separate ways. Walter and Hildegund return to Aquitaine and are said to rule for 30 years. Now, there are a few points of interest when it comes to interpreting Waltharius. The first comes from its setting and characters. Some of the names I mentioned may sound familiar, in particular Hagen, Gunther, and a name at one point used to refer to them, Nibelunges, the Latin form of the German dynastic name Nibelung. This is because they are key figures in perhaps the most famous Germanic hero legend, the Fall of the Burgundians. The story similarly features the Nibelungs stealing treasure from a former ally, but ends with the total destruction of the dynasty in the court of Attila the Hun. This story is told in the Volsung Saga, Nibelungenlied, several poems from the Poetic Edda, and is reinterpreted in Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen. Waltharius is one of the earliest surviving works in this tradition. These legends are vaguely inspired by real history, when the Burgundian kingdom was destroyed by an alliance of Huns and Romans in the 4th century. This resulted in the death of their king Gundaharis, the inspiration for Gunther. An interesting detail in comparison to later versions of the legend, and to real history, is that Waltharius depicts the Nibelungs as ruling the Franks rather than the Burgundians, as in other depictions. This reflects the political world of the author's time. Waltharius was likely composed between the 8th or 10th centuries, when Western Europe was dominated by the Frankish successors to the Carolingian Empire. The city of Worms, the capital of the Burgundians both historically and in the legend of the Nibelungs, was solidly under Frankish control by the time of the poem's composition, so Gunther and Hagen were stated to be Franks. One thing that affects the interpretation of Waltharius, and therefore Walter's story more broadly, is its language. Most Germanic hero legends of this period are written in vernacular language. This makes sense considering they were derived from oral tradition. Waltharius, on the other hand, is written in Latin. The author evokes classical epics by composing the poem in hexameters and referencing Roman gods like Phoebus and Mars. But the author was also clearly versed in Germanic legends of the Migration Age, featuring the Nibelungs, mentioning characters like Wayland the Smith, and using German wordplay. This leads to debate regarding how best to analyze the text. Should it be thought of and interpreted as a Germanic hero legend adapted into Latin by a classically trained author? Or a classical Latin epic in the style of the Aeneid, using German tradition regarding Migration Age Europe as a backdrop? These different lenses of analysis can lead to varied interpretations of the poem. Translators like Dennis Kratz interpret the work as being a satirical critique of Germanic hero epics. This is in part based on interpreting the work's classical imagery. For example, Kratz compares Walter's broken sword to similar moments in the Aeneid and Psychomachia, in which antagonists Turnus and Wrath have their swords shattered. In Kratz's words, neither reference is flattering to Walter, but others disagree with this reading. For example, in his commentary on Brian Murdoch's translation, Leonard Neidorff compares the broken sword to other Germanic legends, such as Beowulf, in which the protagonist's sword breaks with no clear moral judgment being made. Personally, I side with Neidorff's interpretation. This moment seems more about creating a dramatic reversal than implying anything about the character's ethics. As Neidorff notes in his commentary, there are moments when the poet depicts Walter as following Christian standards of virtue, such as emphasizing his chastity in several scenes with Hildegund. It would seem odd to include that sort of detail while also using Walter to critique the ethical standards of the genre. It's important to keep in mind source texts while analyzing a work, but over-relying on them can create interpretations that aren't really supported by the poem itself. That's not to say there isn't an element of cultural critique to Waltharius. This was a common part of the genre, with works such as Beowulf taking time to comment on the destructive results of the character's actions. I just think the criticism of Germanic warrior culture is primarily focused on Gunther and Hagen, with the former leading his loyal vassals to their deaths in a prideful refusal to admit defeat, and the latter betraying his friend in order to uphold an oath and out of blood loyalty to his nephew Padafrid, one of the warriors slain by Waldere. Their attempts to fulfill their respective societal roles of warrior king and loyal vassal only leads to suffering for themselves and others. On the other side, for as much as Waldere seems to revel in violence, he doesn't seek out battle. He tries to bargain with Gunther and allows his enemies to come to him rather than pursuing them in the field. It seems to me that the poet intended for Gunther and his warriors to represent the negative, destructive aspects of Germanic warrior culture, while Waldere remains a virtuous hero. It was once a scholarly consensus that Waltharius was written around 930 CE by a monk named Eckhard I of St. Gallen's Monastery. This was based on a history of St. Gallen's written in the 11th century by Eckhard IV, in which Eckhard I is stated to have written a text referred to as Vita Walthare Manu Fortis, or the life of Walter Stronghand. But as time has gone on, the association between the two texts has been questioned. While Eckhard certainly wrote a Latin text on a character named Walter, there's nothing to indicate it's the same text that has come down to us today. Several manuscripts of the poem feature a prologue by a writer named Gerald, and while it's possible he was a later scribe, he may have also been the work's author. Scholars now generally place Waltharius' composition at some point between the 9th or 10th century. This makes his composition relatively close to that of Waldere, which is written in the 10th or 11th. Now that we understand Waltharius and his place in the tradition, we can use it to better understand Waldere. The scarcity of Old English writing makes it difficult to know how much of the Germanic hero canon existed in British tradition and how widespread it was. But surviving sources indicate English audiences would have been familiar with many characters from continental legends. Most of the characters we mentioned in Waltharius are also mentioned in Old English sources. While there's no Old English version of the Volsung saga, both Gunther and Hagen are mentioned in the Old English poem Widsith, which records the names of tribes and kings featured in Old English legends, as is Gunther's father Gibico and Attila the Hun. Beyond the major players we've already mentioned, there are a few more we should go over. Beowulf features many short diversions, including one in which a king named Sigmund slays a dragon. Sigmund is a prominent character in the Volsung saga, and his son, named Sigurd in the Norse tradition and Siegfried in German, is a key player in the story of the Nibelungs, with his murder by Hagen and Gunther kicking off the dynasty's destruction. Despite his prominence in the continental tradition, Siegfried is not mentioned in any Old English record. Theodoric, the historical king of Ostrogothic Italy, also appeared prominently in Germanic hero legends such as Dietrich's saga and the Nibelungenlied. Like Attila and the Burgundians, he's mentioned in Widsith, in addition to another Old English poem, Dior. Dior consists of several vignettes of suffering characters who appear in other Germanic legends. One of those vignettes focuses on Wayland, a character who is featured prominently in the Old English record. Wayland was a legendary smith who's the creator of a variety of great weapons and pieces of armor in early medieval legends. In addition to being mentioned in Dior, he is shown on a panel of an 8th century English whalebone box known as the Frank's Casket, and is said to have made Beowulf's armor. He is also mentioned in Waltharius, where he is said to have made Walter's armor. Widsith also mentions a character named Widia, and while it's not mentioned in the work itself, in the broader tradition he's Wayland's son. He's prominently featured in one of the other major sources for the Walter legend, the Theodric saga, in which he serves King Theodoric and wields Miming, a sword made by his father. There are more legendary figures depicted in Old English literature, but these are the ones most relevant when discussing Waldere. As mentioned before, Waldere consists of 63 lines split between two fragments. There seem to have been at least a few pages between them, as there is a clear gap in the narrative. Both fragments appear to take place shortly before the climactic battle between Walter and Gunther, here called Waldere and Guthere. Given how short these fragments are, there's no need to summarize, so I'll just read a translation and add commentary as I go. In the first fragment, the speaker addresses Walter, referring to him as Alfhere's son and a warrior of Attila. The identity of the speaker is unclear, but it's probably the Old English equivalent to Hildegund, as they spend the poem praising Waldere and reassuring him that he'll be able to defeat Guthere. The fragment begins midline with, "Encourage him eagerly. Of course, Wayland's work shall not fail any man that can firmly hold Miming. Often at battle fell, died with blood and wounded with sword, one man after another. Attila's point warrior, do not let your courage fail you now. Lordliness..." Some words are lost here. So far the speaker has mentioned Miming, the sword of Wayland and Widia. This is interesting to compare with Waltharius, where Wayland is said to have made Walter's armor, but there's no mention of who made his sword. Returning to the poem, "Now the day has come that you shall do one of two things. Lose your life, or win lasting glory among men, Alfhere's son. I would never, my friend, dishonor you with words, that I have seen you at swordplay disgrace an opponent, nor refrain from battle or flee over the ramparts to save your body, though many enemies hew at your armor with weapons. Instead, you always drive the battle forward, pushing over the limit. I have feared God that you seek battle too rashly, and will at a point with another man fight to the death. Honor yourself with great deeds while God is with you. Do not fear for your sword. That great treasure was given to help. With it you shall Waltharius vow humiliate, because he began this battle. Unjustly he first sought it. He refused the sword and the treasures, the many rings. Now he shall ringless turn from this battle. The Lord must return to his old homeland or sleep on the ground. If he the... And that ends fragment 1. The speaker tells of Walter's courage, skill, and potential foolhardiness. They also mention Walter's links to Attila and Alfhere, the Old English name for his father Alfar. This last section allows us to place the fragment in the narrative. This speech is after Gunther has stopped them and refused their offer of handing over the treasure for safe passage. It's unclear if this takes place after Walter's defeat of Gunther's warriors, before, or if Waldere even features Burgundian warriors other than Gunther and Hagen. Fragment 2 begins with another unidentified speaker, this time likely Gunther. This segment consists of a flighting, a pre-battle taunting match commonly seen in poetic works of this period, such as the Battle of Malden. The line cuts in partway through the speaker boasting about their sword. Better sword, except for the one I also hold, in a stone case, secretly hidden. I know that Theodoric thought to send it to Wigia himself alongside great wealth. Treasure with the blade, gold adorned, a reward for past deeds, because from captivity Netheta's kin, Wayland's son Wigia, released him. Through the enemy's domain he hastened. This section records a story about Wigia, the son of Wayland, saving Theodoric from captivity in a hostile land, and that Theodoric hoped to reward him with this sword. What sword is being discussed here is somewhat ambiguous. The speaker seems to be referencing Miming with its association with Wigia, but it's possible they're describing a different weapon. A word of interest in this section is stonfata, which I have translated here with its most literal meaning, stone case. It's however commonly translated as jeweled sheath, which makes somewhat more sense if they have the sword in the scene, though it's possible the speaker believes the sword to be secured somewhere else, perhaps in a stone box. The poem then transitions to Walter, who addresses someone he refers to as friend of the Burgundians. This is a common formula for referring to kings in Old English, seen in Beowulf when Hrothgar is referred to as friend of the Danes. This means Walter is certainly addressing the king of the Burgundians, Gunther. This confirms alongside Widsith that while the Nibelungs were considered Frankish by the poet of Waltharius, they were Burgundians in the English tradition. Waldere then spoke, courageous hero, a battle aid in his hand. Gripping his war sword, these words he spoke. So you indeed believed, friend of Burgundians, that Hagen's hand would fight well and separate me from battle. Take it if you dare, from the battle-weary one. The grey breastplate. It's here on my shoulders, Alfhere's heirloom. Good and interlocking, gold-adorned, completely flawless. A princely garment to have when hands defend their life hoards from enemies. It will not fail me when Niflhe's kin again attempts to meet me with swords, as you did. The victory may be given to one who is always ready and counseled, always right. Whoever believes in the holy help, in God's support, he shall find it there. If the merits are considered, then the proud must distribute wealth, control possessions. That is... And from here the poem trails off again. There's some ambiguity surrounding the phrase I translated as Niflhe's kin, as the text is a bit muddled in the original manuscript. There's a series of faded marks followed by the word unmag, a variant on the word mag meaning kin, that likely means bad kin. This has been interpreted in a variety of ways over the years, with words like yifl or ale. I chose the interpretation used in Jonathan Hymes' version of the text, in which the phrase is rendered as Niflhe's mag, meaning Niflhe's kin, which is a potential variant on the dynastic name of the Nibelung. Having finished the fragments, we're still left with gaps in the narrative. While it might be tempting to fill those gaps with details from Waltharius, and the full version certainly contained many of the same plot beats, there are a number of glaring differences between the two texts. Waltharius' Hildegund fears the oncoming battle, while her unnamed equivalent in Waldere cheers Walter on. The sword Miming goes unmentioned in Waltharius, while it seems to play a key role in Waldere. Both versions place emphasis on Walter's armor, but in Waltharius it's made by Wayland, while in Waldere it's inherited from his father, who's only mentioned at the very beginning of the Latin version. If there are such easily identifiable differences in the 62 surviving lines, there were likely more in the full version. We don't know how characters like Hagen and Attila were characterized, the details of Walter's flight, or if Gunther was accompanied by the same set of warriors as in Waltharius. We don't even know the name of Hildegund's equivalent, or if there even was one. The only indication at her presence is that the speaker in Fragment A seems to match her role. There could be any number of deviations from the more common version of the story, lost alongside the missing pages. There's also some debate regarding whether or not Waldere and Waltharius share an ending, with Gunther, Hagen, and Walter all surviving while losing parts of their bodies. It's been suggested that in the source for Waltharius, Walter, Hagen, or Gunther were killed in the battle, although this is unlikely as none of the analogous stories feature a tragic ending, and the characters appear in stories set after this one. But it's also worth mentioning that none of those future depictions show any of these characters as missing limbs, indicating that may have been a story beat original to Waltharius, and potentially not reflected in the broader tradition or in Waldere. What indicates that the Old English version of Walter's story may have ended similarly to that of his continental counterpart are the frequent references throughout the fragments to the reliability of his sword and the strength of his grip. Waltharius makes several references to Walter's stronghold of his weapon, creating dramatic irony when he loses his right hand during his fight with Hagen. In the Waldere fragment, attention is frequently put on Walter's hands, and much of the first fragment is spent assuring Walter that miming is a reliable weapon to anyone who can firmly hold it. This may be alluding to a similarly ironic conclusion for Waldere, with Walter being failed by both his grip and his weapon. Of the 3 lost texts I've discussed in my past few videos, more of Waldere survives than the other 2. The Book of the Lion exists only in a few offhand mentions, and the Skuldunga saga as a paraphrase, while we have actual surviving lines of Waldere. Yet of the 3, Waldere was the closest to being truly and completely lost. Being written by one of the medieval era's most famous writers, there's always going to be discussion of the Book of the Lion. We don't have the prose, but the plot of the Skuldunga saga has been preserved, and the text is mentioned by contemporary sources. Even without a copy of either text, we have evidence that they once existed. But there's no contemporary mentions of Waldere, and its author is unknown. If we didn't have these 2 fragments, we never would have known it existed. In a way, Waldere is lucky, because there are thousands of other medieval texts that didn't survive at all. Their stories and characters are completely unknown. Their loss can't even be mourned, as we never knew they existed in the first place. This is what I mean when I say Waldere was the closest to being truly lost. If E.C. Werloff hadn't found Waldere, or overlooked the 2 ragged pieces of parchment, we never would have known that the Old English had a version of Walter's legend, much less would we be able to read it. So to those of you watching, don't be sad we only have 63 lines of Waldere, or only a paraphrase of the Skuldunga saga, or a brief mention of the Book of the Lion, but be happy and grateful we have any version of these works at all. Every medieval text that has survived to the modern day has beaten the odds to get here, even in fragmentary condition. We should appreciate what we have, rather than focusing on what we don't. And with that, we finished the Lost Books series. I intend to put all of these together in a single video with some errors corrected and rougher sections re-recorded. I wanted to start doing book recommendations at the end of these videos, and for this one I chose a major resource for my research, Waltharius, the Latin epic of Walter of Aquitaine, an English translation of Waltharius by Brian Murdoch, edited by Leonard Nydorf. Translations of Waltharius can be expensive and hard to come by, so I'm very thankful Uppsala Books made this one available. If my description of Waltharius interested you, I heavily recommend picking up this edition. They have another book coming out later this year which compiles Middle-High German sources for the story, which I am eagerly anticipating. I'm not entirely sure which video will be coming out next, but it will likely be a video on King Alfred in a similar style to my Charlemagne video, or one of a few non-history videos I've been working on. See you next time.